Sheikh Hasina, the ousted Prime Minister of Bangladesh, is in Delhi for the foreseeable future. This much we now know officially. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. These are the images continuing to be viral in Bangladesh. Protesters ransacking the residence of the former Prime Minister, walking out with her saris. Meanwhile, Bangladeshi media is reporting that in 27 districts, Hindu community, the religious minority in Bangladesh, has come under attack. There are real concerns over whether the army, which is currently in charge, is in full control of the street. In the meantime, the Modi government has held an all-party meeting with outreach to opposition leaders, including Rahul Gandhi. Reports suggest that even opposition leaders are asking questions about not just security concerns and implications for India, but about whether there's a possible Pakistan and China link to the protests. Bangladeshi people are responding angrily to these suggestions in Indian media, saying that it implies that the people on the street have no agency, no mind of their own. There are many questions that are mounting, including what next. Even if the street protests were completely organic, there are very, very clear security implications for India. National Security Advisor Ajit Doval has met with Sheikh Hasina, who is, as I said, in India at a secret safe house. Meanwhile, those images of the founding father of Bangladesh, Mujibur Rahman, also Sheikh Hasina's father, those statues being toppled down, vandalized, really among the more disturbing images that are emerging from Bangladesh today. In India, there seem to be two kinds of responses. One response seems to argue that this is democracy against authoritarianism. This is a revolution led by young students. The other view seems to talk about China and the Americans colluding, the enemies of the Indian state colluding to create a regime, whichever regime comes next, that will be closer to China and Pakistan than it will be to Delhi. Could it be possible that there are shades of truth to both arguments? Or is this really the end of authoritarianism? And what might follow next is an answer that we don't have, but it's a question we can certainly ask. Let me ask that question of our two guests today who are on this program with two very different perspectives. Salil Tripathi, author and journalist, is with us. Welcome to the program. And also joining us is Sadanand Dhume, Wall Street Journal columnist, who has, in fact, just days ago, a very interesting column out on this very issue and this very question. And we'll come to what he said in his column in a moment. But I want to start by playing out what Foreign Minister Jaishankar said in Parliament. Take a look.
On 4th August, events took a very serious turn. Attacks on the police, including police stations and government installations, intensified even as overall levels of violence greatly escalated. Properties of individuals associated with the regime were torched across the country. What was particularly worrying was that minorities, their businesses and temples also came under attack at multiple locations. The full extent of this is still not clear. Sir, on 5th August, demonstrators converged in Dhaka despite the curfew. Our understanding is that after a meeting with leaders of the security establishment, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina apparently made the decision to resign. At very short notice, she requested approval to come for the moment to India. We simultaneously received a request for flight clearance from Bangladesh authorities. She arrived yesterday evening in Delhi. The situation in Bangladesh, sir, is still evolving. The Army Chief, General Waqar-uz-Zaman, addressed the nation on 5th August. He spoke about assuming responsibility and constituting an interim government.
All right. So what is actually happening in Bangladesh? Is this a people's revolution, or is it army rule? Is it the rise of democracy, or is it the rise of, to borrow a quote from Sadanand's latest Wall Street Journal article, hardened Islamists? Sadanand, I'll start with you. What you essentially argue in your column is not that Sheikh Hasina was without flaws, but that with all her flaws, the alternatives for Bangladesh, for South Asia, were much worse. The phrase you use is hardened Islamists. We've already seen restrictions on the Jamaat-e-Islami being lifted hours after Hasina fled from Delhi.
Shut up.
And
Sorry.
no
You can
problem.
saying hi, but
But hi, Kokum. He may as well join the conversation as well. Everybody has a right to an opinion. But my question to you is this. Bangladeshi friends that I've been talking to, when I put this argument to them, they say that, look, Jamaatis and the extremist element may have been part of what unfolded on the street, but it's never been what has captured the full essence of the Bangladeshi people. So to caricature or to reduce what's unfolded in Bangladesh to hardened Islamism or the rise of Islamism or the rise of jihadist groups is very unfair and whitewashes what the Hasina regime was guilty of. Why do you believe that Hasina, for all her flaws, to quote from your piece, which is on the screen, was the best alternative, maybe from a bunch of not so great options?
well, thanks, Barkha. I mean, first of all, I agree with that criticism, and it is not my argument that Bangladesh is suddenly going to turn into some version of Taliban ruled Afghanistan or something like that. I don't think there's going to be any kind of Islamist takeover. I do think that the room for Islamists will increase, and I think if you look at the history of that part of the world, regardless of the fact that the Jamaat may get a small percentage of the vote, there has always been a tension between the kind of linguistic nationalism which was preached by the Awami League and a more religion-inflected nationalism that was preached by the BNP and its allies in the Jamaat. And we have seen the record of what happened between 2001 and 2006 when the BNP was in power with its allies in the Jamaat. No one says that Bangladesh became an Islamist country, but it is certainly true that terrorist groups such as like Hujibi found refuge over there. It's certainly true that there was a sense of persecution of religious minorities, particularly of Hindus, but also some of Buddhists. So the record has not been very good. The underlying ideology has not been very promising. And the most important thing over here is that, I take on board a lot of the criticisms people have made of Sheikh Hasina. But the question that we have to ask ourselves very calmly and clearly is that, do we think that the post-Hasina dispensation will be better for Bangladesh, better for India, and better for the region on some very basic parameters? Will it have good relations with its neighbors, including its most important neighbor, India? Will it continue down the path of economic development where Sheikh Hasina was quite successful? And will it hold to the pluralistic ideas that were central to the Bangladesh liberation struggle? The early images I see coming out of Dhaka and elsewhere are not at all promising. And I have to I'll just shut my dog up. I'm very, very sorry.
While you actually do that, I want to take to Salil the point that you're making, and I think what Sadanand is saying is a kind of complex argument that if criticize Hasina for the way she handled the protests, criticize her for the crackdown on protesters, criticize her for the use of violence on protesters, for rigging elections, all of which are documented and serious allegations. However, what's going to follow? Because I've been talking to people in Bangladesh who are saying we don't right now know who's in control, and there might be nobody in control. And some people are drawing parallels with Egypt and the quote unquote Arab Spring, where when Hosni Mubarak fell, there was a great air of celebration, but then what followed was sort of the rise of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. I guess I'm paraphrasing Sadanand here, but it seems a little bit of a similar argument. Your take?
Yeah, so several things here and that are worth bearing in mind. Now, you mentioned Egypt, so let's start with that first. That Muslim Brotherhood already had a huge, vast following in Bangladesh, in Egypt, sorry, in Egypt. We have never seen the Jamaat getting more than 10% of the vote, except in 1991. And it is now truly a spent force. True, when Hifazat-e-Islam goes on a march, hundreds of thousands of people turn up. But from India, from all the populous South Asian countries, getting 100,000 people to march is not a difficult task for any political party. Even the communists can do that if they want to do it in India, although they are a spent force in Indian politics. So I wouldn't go by the sheer size of numbers as a problem, as an issue. Not only is Jamaat a spent force politically in Bangladesh, but you also have to see that a lot of its leadership is decimated. Some of its leaders have been executed in the war crimes tribunals. Over the last 6 or 8 years that there have been these tribunals in Bangladesh. So creating Jamaat is basically a bogey. And yes, there have been certain attacks on minorities, as the foreign minister mentioned in his intervention in the parliament. But it's not as if attacking minorities is a Bangladeshi uniqueness or circumstance. It happens in India all the time too. Now, I'm not therefore saying whataboutery here that because it happens in India, it's okay in Bangladesh. But the fact remains there are also images that have come out, two particular sets of images I would point out to, of young Muslim men standing in front of Dhakeshwari temple in Dhaka.
I think we have that image.
Yes,
I
protecting
think we have that image.
across Bangladesh, dozens and hundreds of temples. You have young Muslim men standing arm in arm and stopping any attack on those temples. We have to recognize that. And there are slogans like Hindu Muslim Bhai Bhai that the Muslims are saying. Now you could argue that who are they protecting that from? That's not the issue. They're protecting them from lumpen elements and criminals who are present in almost every faith. Just as the so-called Mombatti walas in India stand in front of mosques and protect, whether or regardless of the religion, there are secular-minded Muslims in Bangladesh who are protecting those properties. Secondly, you showed the images of people stealing things from Hasina's house, which is terrible. But I've also known, and I've spoken to people in Dhaka, including student leaders, who have gone back to the same places and who have gone back to the people and pleaded with and ordered them to return the property. Now, of course, you can't rebuild Mujibs' house. And it's a terrible, terrible thing that Mujibs' house has been burned down because it's a museum. And it's a historical place where Mujib was shot at the top of the stairs and he tumbled down and his bloodstains were still kept there on that wall. And now it's an ashen place. And that's terrible what has happened there. But to blame the students for that is, again, fundamentally wrong. So all I'm trying to say that it's an extremely complicated picture. Whenever you have had a pressure of this kind, where people have been curbed for 15 years, and it's not only a few press freedom. You had Mahfouz Anam on your show. He has more than 70 cases against him on Daily Star. And if he were to pay every taka that he has to pay, it would pay Bangladesh's public debt 3 times over or something like that.
Okay. So let me ask you, when you see the images of Mujibur Rahman being brought down, not just his house ransacked. We have seen in multiple locations, if we can play those pictures, please, in multiple locations, the statues being brought down. And we saw a horrible image today of a protester urinating on his statue, right? We have seen a protester walk out with, that's the video, with undergarments from Sheikh Hasina's house and be filmed doing that. Now, I take your point that in any big street protest, there are elements that resort to vandalism, hooliganism, that doesn't capture the entire protest. But why are Mujibur Rahman statues, the founding father of Bangladesh, being brought down? What does that tell us? What does that tell you?
How much anger Hasina provoked. Basically, Mujib is bearing the sins of his daughter. Mujib's statue is bearing the sins of the daughter. Because we have to recognize that, you mentioned the fact that, there are human rights abuse but they've not only happened in the last 15 days when these 200 or 300 people have died. The disappearances in Bangladesh over the last 15 years are enormous. Bloggers have been killed. The Digital Security Act is far more nefarious in Bangladesh than in India. It's a copy of the Indian Act and it is much worse than that. Corruption has been rampant. Nepotism has been rampant. The control over the party, the control over judiciary, the control over the military, the control over the administration has been significant. And people say that you're elected 5 times. No, Hasina was elected twice, in 1996 and then in 1990 and then in 2008. All the elections that followed, she was either elected more or less unopposed because the opposition boycotted it, or there was so much voter intimidation that within 2 hours in 2019, the opposition decided to boycott.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have to bear all this in mind to understand why people are so angry.
Let me bring in Sadanand on perhaps the most provocative thing that Salil has said so far, that these statues that are coming down of the founding father of Bangladesh, the country would not exist without him. India helped birth Bangladesh. This is the father basically carrying the cross, or the father's statue carrying the cross for the sins of the daughter. It points to the level or the depth of repression by Hasina, that when people like yourselves argue that she's still the best option, you're essentially making an anti-democracy argument.
So a couple of quick points. First, let me sort of, on one little factual thing. The bloggers were not killed by the Sheikh Hasina government. The bloggers were killed by machete-wielding Islamists. And if anything, you can fault the Sheikh Hasina government for not doing enough to protect them. But they weren't being killed by the government. That's number one, right? That's at least your talk.
I think Salil wants to interject. Salil?
One quick intervention, only to say that, yes, Sheikh Hasina's government did not kill them, B, did not protect them, and C, the government actually told the bloggers to shut up and not say things that are offensive.
Correct. And if
Yeah.
anyone thinks that there's going to be more room for atheist bloggers in Bangladesh in 2024, then I have a bridge to sell them.
No.
So that's my the sort of that's the sort of small sort of factual point. The larger question really is that you have to separate two different things. I think the critique of Sheikh Hasina's illiberalism is a valid critique. It's one that I've made myself. Right, stuff like going after Mahfouzana, bogging him down in cases. I remember the photographer Shoaib Alam was like, just
Yeah.
because he was, giving an interview to Al Jazeera, and nobody condones any of that. And I think that's certainly something that where the anger was justified. But you have to be able to separate that from what is happening post Hasina. And what is happening post Hasina, there are basically two views. One is what I would call the rosy-eyed view, which is that, oh, well, Jamaat never got too many seats and so on. And therefore, Bangladesh is going to sort of continue on this path of broadly secular economic development. And the minorities are going to be okay. The economy is going to do well. Foreign relations are going to be stable. But we won't have the excesses that we saw under Hasina. Now, if that happens, I'd be the happiest person. I think that would be a wonderful outcome for Bangladesh. It would be a wonderful outcome for India. It would be a wonderful outcome for the region. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I think that the signs you're seeing, I think the extreme vandalism of all these monuments to do with Mujibur Rahman, they can't be wished away. They have enormous symbolic significance, because what is happening over here is it is a very clear attempt to erase and rewrite the history of that country, including its founding moment. They have burned down his house. What does that mean? That memorializes his life, that memorializes his assassination. That is gone. They have brought down not just that one statue that we just saw on screen, but they've also took a JCB to another monument. They have attacked the houses of many serving ministers in the government, but they have also gone after just regular Hindus. Now, where is any of this in line with the sort of idea we have of this post-Hasina liberalism? All I'm saying is very clear, that a post-Hasina dispensation, in my mind, is not likely to be more liberal, but its illiberalism will probably be tinged with religious fervor. Now, to the point about Jamaat, right? I think the problem with this discussion is that these things tend to get sort of bogged down into minutiae about this party got which percent of vote. And the point is that Islamism is a set of ideas. Now, those ideas are to what extent should a radical form of religion or an extreme form of religion play a role in the public square? Now, it may be, at some point it may be championed mainly by Jamaat. At other point, it may be championed mainly by a group like Hifazat-e-Islam. And even Sheikh Hasina, as I point out in my column, has made compromises with these elements. The point from a sort of is to look at whether these elements in Bangladeshi society are going to be strengthened or weakened. My belief is they are going to be strengthened.
Okay. Salil, can we logically argue against the argument that Sadanand has just made, given what has unfolded in the last 24 hours? Now, you can hope that the last 24 hours will not be representative of what happens in the next few weeks and months. But what is the basis to hope that? What is the basis to hope that there is going to be a kind of new Bangladesh with a new kind of politics where, yes, if there was shrinking space for expression and civil rights under Hasina, what I'm hearing Sadanand say is that that space is going to reduce and shrink even further. And when you attack the statues, or when you vandalize, burn, bring down the statues of Mujibur Rahman, what you're effectively doing is questioning the tenets on which the country is founded. And for India in particular, it's a little bit like being the midwife who helped deliver a baby and have that baby turn against, the parent. That I might be mixing metaphors here, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the baby has turned against the parent. I mean, that's a very nice way of looking at it. So my question would be, what did the parent do to earn that hatred? I think it's worth examining that. And the other question is, why is it that even the midwife is hated so much? I think the mistake that a lot of people in India have made, including the analysts, is exactly falling for this kind of diet, that it's Hasina or bust kind of a thing, that, everything else is just terrible, and believing this idea that, this is a Chinese conspiracy or an American conspiracy or a Pakistani conspiracy, which completely, as Mahfouz Anam told you, denies Bangladeshi people their agency. People are being killed, yes, but yes, there have been Hindu homes attacked and or temples attacked. I'm not denying that even for a minute. So don't get me wrong. But out of the 200 to 300 people, I can bet that the vast majority who have been killed in the last 2 weeks are Muslims, right? And because Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country, it's like, when you talk about the number of people who died in the 71 war, vast majority of those who died were in that quote unquote genocide, because Bangladesh calls it Gonohotta, were actually Muslim people who were Bangla nationalists. So it's Bangladeshi upon Bangladeshi violence. The criminal and the lumpen are going after those who are law-abiding or bystanders. That's the way to see it, rather than see it in this religious divide.
So let me ask you this. Do you see this as a moment of hope? Or do you see this as a military coup? Hang on, let me ask the question. Yeah. Do you see this as a coup, a military coup? Or do you see this as a people's revolution?
I do see it as a people's revolution, because the military has basically stood up by the side. The curfew was on. And when the curfew was on, you had the military basically putting its guns down and letting people go. So, I mean, in a subtle way, the military was signaling that we are on your side. And it was a people-led revolution. You didn't see a general coming with a gun and telling Hasina it's time to leave. That hasn't happened. I mean, whatever the conversation that took place between senior officers and, except for one junior officer and one retired commander, there was no public remark from people within the military saying one way or the other. And actually, Hasina had got its military organized such that she had her own loyalists in the senior position. So they were acceding to what people were. So it is definitely a people-led movement. It is a student-led movement, and the students' demands have been very just. The first thing they asked yesterday, when I was listening to some of the student podcasts, one of them was basically saying that the president has to dissolve the parliament, which is the necessary, because the parliament itself was a sham. It was not a genuine elected parliament.
Okay, let me ask the same question to Sadanand. Sadanand, is this a people's revolution or a military coup?
Well, I mean, I think technically it's obviously a military coup, right? You have the army chief is in charge. He's calling the shots. The elected leader has fled the country. Now, I think that this is a very interesting slippery slope, and we should not romanticize uprisings simply because there may be students involved. And certainly there were students involved at various elements at various times in this movement. The fact of the matter is that Sheikh Hasina, everyone agrees that the last election was flawed, but there was an election. The people in power right now have not been elected. So I hope that there's a very quick restoration of democracy. The second thing is that raises a question in any country, right? Because if you have you can have a situation where there is a, disgruntled minority, say, right? And let's just say that the 49% of a country supports one person and 51% supports another, and 49% has disgruntled elements, they lose an election. It's not very difficult to mobilize a few thousands of people and then take them to parliament, and then but the problem with that is that there lies a route to profound instability. So I don't think that in any situation, I don't think that these kinds of uprisings should automatically be legitimized. In any case, I think the most what is more pertinent over here in this particular case is what comes next. And my question comes down to, again, the question: what were the three main achievements that all reasonable people would agree upon in the last 15 years of Sheikh Hasina rule? Number one, Bangladesh going from being seen as an economic basket case to being seen something a little bit more akin to the Southeast Asian economies, particularly because they built this $47 billion garment industry. GDP growth averaged 6.5% for 10 years, which is quite impressive. Poverty rate is down to 5% as measured by the World Bank. And within 2 years, the UN says that it's going to graduate out of the group of least developed countries. It's a very significant achievement, right? If you look at the 57 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, apart from the ones that happen to be blessed with oil and gas, there are very, very few that have managed any form of industrialization. I'm not saying that Bangladesh had suddenly become Denmark, but it was on a very good path economically. So number one is, will the post-Hasina dispensation be able to preserve and expand upon those gains? Number two, I think Sheikh Hasina had a foreign policy that was very practical. It was based on an understanding that India is the most important country in the region and that Bangladesh needed good ties with India. It needed to crack down on terrorist groups that were targeting India from Bangladeshi soil. She did an excellent, and it needed to have an ideology that was completely the opposite of Pakistan's when it came to India. Before Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh's ideology or Bangladesh's sort of approach to India was quite similar to Pakistan's in some ways, right? So that's the second part: a pragmatic foreign policy based on the country's development needs and based on a realization that good ties with India are central to development. And the third plank is an understanding that Bangladesh is a pluralistic nation and that it has various cultural strands that have come together. And being Muslim does not mean that you should be at war with your Hindu past. These are the three outstanding elements. Beyond that, I think a lot of the criticisms of Sheikh Hasina are completely valid. But on these three questions, I'd like to ask Salil, does he see room for optimism? Because on each of these three, I think the case for pessimism at this moment in time is stronger than the case for optimism.
So, Salil, go ahead. Economic progress, a kind of compact, a pluralistic compact with religious minorities, and a practical foreign policy, which certainly leaned in favor of India.
Yeah, so the first part is the economics. And we have to look back at the fact that, the garment export industry in Bangladesh, there are two parts to it. One is it goes back to 1978. Hasina did not create it. It was always there. And it took off because of the way the global garment trade functioned, particularly fast fashion. People wanted cheaper clothing, and Bangladesh had the competitive advantage, which is essentially cheap labor. And that's a very, very, very quicksilver thing, and people can move elsewhere. Bangladeshi manufacturers themselves are aware, and they are now investing in places like Mauritius and elsewhere, and investing in Africa and so on, because they know that there will be a time when it will be hard for them to sustain the industry there, which is fine. That's how globalization should work, and I'm not objecting to that. And yes, all the other indicators you talked about, social development, economic, I have written about that too. But probably where we might disagree a bit is that I've always felt that Bangladesh succeeds despite the government and not because of the government. Because a lot of the change that you see in Bangladesh is because of the hard work that the overseas Bangladesh worker does when he sends money that he earns.
So no credit to Hasina.
No, I'm not saying no credit, but some credit to it, perhaps. But we have
I think Sadanand has an interjection. Sadanand?
Yeah. No, you're muted.
Can we just focus this for a minute? On those three questions, the question is simple. Do you think the path ahead, 2024 onward, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic on each of those three? I have said very clearly that I think each of those three gains are endangered.
Yeah. So I get that. So on economics, I think I remain optimistic. I think it can remain the way it is. I don't see any reason to think it would be endangered. If it is endangered, it's because the garment industry moves elsewhere. It finds a cheaper location.
Instability is poison for business.
What is poison for business? The unrest. But Bangladesh is a hortal. Bangladesh is the capital of hortals in the world.
They lose about
they lose about 70 to 80 days a year of work because of strikes in any case, regardless of the government in power. So that's one thing. On foreign policy, I simply don't know, because I don't know who the next foreign minister is going to be and who. So that's something I would park for now. I would not really get into it. Whether it is good for India or not is not the concern for the Bangladeshi. Whoever is there should be good for Bangladesh. That
was my argument, that it was good for Bangladesh.
Yeah. Would it be? I don't know. Because you don't know who the next foreign minister is. I don't know who the next foreign minister is. If Yunus is actually going to be in charge of Bangladesh in some form, he's going to be appointed probably as an advisor. I see that as a very good thing, because I think Muhammad Yunus is a good man whose heart is in the right place. He is now getting older, which is true. But if him and Kamal
he's 84 years old, Muhammad Yunus. But yes, the students have asked for him to be the caretaker, sort of advisor to the government and so on. But on the last point, which is perhaps one of the most critical points of what will happen to religious minorities.
So I see, no. So I see no. I take, it's a question of glass half full and half empty. Sadanand thinks it's going to be bad for them. I take hope from the images that we have seen.
I'm saying, what is the base? Well, so that's what I'm trying to understand. what's the basis for your glass half full view?
So I've been there often, right? I've written a book on Bangladesh, and I know the Sushil Somaj, as they call the civil society there. And I know that the spirit of 71, which was to a Bengali nationalist country, which is basically Bengali and Muslims. A great poem by the Bangladeshi American poet Tarfia Faizullah, where a Pakistani soldier is about to rape a Bangladeshi woman. And at that time, he yanks her by her hair. And this is also the poem, but it's a very poetic image. It's worth, and say, are you a Muslim or a Bengali? And she says, both. And he slaps her again. And I think that's something that the failure to and this is the point Mahfouz Anam has been repeatedly making, that this is exactly what India mistakes, and which is why India continues to see Bangladesh as Pakistan in the East. When it is something different, it is far more syncretic than Pakistan is.
Okay, let's take exactly that statement to discuss what's being debated in India right now. Sheikh Hasina is in Delhi at a secret safe house. Ajit Doval has met her. The debate now is how long is she going to stay here? The United Kingdom is showing no particular keenness. It's got enough trouble in its own backyard to open its doors. She might go to some other European country. There is a debate ongoing. I actually had on my other program, a veteran Indian diplomat suggest that India should give her asylum. Sadanand, what do you say?
I think it's a tough one, right? The pluses and minuses. On the one hand, I think that India needs to show that it'll stand by its friends. And if it rejects Hasina at its moment of need, it sends a signal around the world that India cannot be trusted to back its friends in times of need. So, in that sense, I do think that India should offer her asylum, or if she asks for asylum in India, India should accept it. On the other hand, we must be sort of very clear that there would be downsides to India. Because at this moment she's very unpopular, and it'll sort of strengthen the narrative, which I think is a false narrative, by the way, that Sheikh Hasina was simply some kind of Indian puppet and did not represent the aspirations of the Bengali people or for Bangladesh.
Yeah, Salil?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, I take both those points. I understand that there are advantages to give the asylum to her out of compassionate ground. If she goes back, she will be mistreated. She might get tortured. She might be put in jail for a long time, and so on. But that's exactly the practical reality. In 2016, India signed the extradition treaty with Bangladesh, which is that people who are quote unquote criminals can be extradited when the other country asks. What is to prevent a vengeful future government in Bangladesh to say that she has stolen the money and she has to answer for the 200 people who were killed by her police force over the 2 weeks, and therefore she is a criminal and please return her to us? And what would be the grounds for India to say no? It creates an incredible moral dilemma for India, whether to abide by the extradition treaty or not. And therefore, it is actually in India's interest that she doesn't stay in India.
I would agree with that, Sadanand. Why would India wade into this?
No, I think it's in India's interest. I agree with Salil. It is in India's interest for her not to stay. But I think that if she asks and is rejected, it would reflect extremely poorly on India, and it would send a message to any leader in the region who is going to ever be seen as pro-India that this is a very unreliable country to lean toward.
Well, we don't know enough of what she's actually thinking because there's been very, very little on-record commentary. But there have been not just whispers, Sadanand, but opposition. Okay, firstly, one should say something good about what's happening here in India. We have actually seen a kind of reaffirming bipartisan dialogue between the government and the opposition leaders today. And, from Mamata Banerjee to the Congress party, everybody has said that they will take their cue more or less from what the government guides them to do. We don't know fully, can we come out of these pictures now? We don't know fully what the government's mind is. I think they're just right now reading the battleground, waiting for things to develop. But even Congress leaders are saying, is there a Pakistan-China link here? There are other conspiracy theories about how this may suit America, others say it may suit China. What's your take on that? That's the street protest of the ouster of Hasina.
So I think a lot of the sort of, conversation, for example, on X tends to be like, lurid and overheated and conspiratorial. First of all, the idea that the US and China would conspire together is just like laughably stupid, right? I mean, I don't know how anyone could possibly believe that. Now, the question I think really is sort of, is what would a future dispensation likely look like? And if the Jamaat has a role, and here I feel that the sort of talk about numbers and all is a red herring. If the Jamaat has a role in government, as we've seen before, or if the Jamaat's ideas have a greater currency in society, as we've seen before, then I think you do see a sort of, a somewhat of a reorientation of Bangladesh in a direction that is not favorable to India. It remains to be seen how powerful the army will be in the years ahead. The Bangladesh army does have, along with Pakistan, it's the only other major army in the region that actually buys weapons from China. So the Chinese will certainly be looking for an opportunity. I think it's a fluid situation, but there's no question that this is a setback for India. Now, whether India can salvage something from this is going to depend on the nature of the next Bangladeshi government. And most crucially, the question really is that will Bangladesh's new rulers, whoever they are, will they recognize that there is wisdom in the essential Sheikh Hasina template, which is economic development, stable relations with India, and a pluralistic domestic ideology? Will they see value in that template, or will they seek to reject that template? My own pessimistic view is that the early signs suggest that even if they don't reject it fully, they will reject it in large measure. And I think that would be very bad for the prospects of Bangladesh, but also bad for the region more broadly.
Salil?
One is that, I have two quick thoughts about that. One is that if you look at United States, in 80 days, they are going to elect a president, right? They are already concerned about what's happening in Venezuela. Gaza is a big dividing issue. Ukraine is a big issue for them. How to deal with China. Bangladesh is going to get 3 seconds of any State Department's thinking at this moment. It's not there unless it blows up in a big way. Nobody is going to pay attention to Bangladesh, which is exactly something worth bearing in mind. The second is the role of military, and whether or not it's an army coup. We have to remember that one of the biggest sources of revenue for the Bangladeshi armed forces today are the contracts it has with the UN peacekeeping forces. It's one of the biggest suppliers of soldiers for UN peacekeeping forces. It has been very lucrative for the Bangladesh government and for the army, and it has freed up the Bangladeshi budget to do a lot of good things on social development indicators. You cannot be a part of the peacekeeping force when you are a tyrant at home. So it is against the interest of the army to behave in an irresponsible manner, which probably explains why the army has acted the way it has. And we have to recognize the changed nature of Bangladesh army today compared to the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, when they were trigger happy and killing leaders left, right, and center and taking over the governments.
Okay, I've got to close, and the same question for both of you. Salil, I'll start with you. Sadanand made a point that just because students are on the streets or a large number of people on the streets doesn't automatically mean that there is legitimacy or value in that uprising. And there could be lessons from history that show us that what comes after the uprising can be worse than what the uprising was protesting. That's the hub of the debate.
That's entirely possible. I mean, it's very hard, prediction is always hard, and particularly about the future. I mean, I'm just joking here, but it's very hard to say what it will happen. But we have to, I think we can at least agree on the fact that there are legitimate reasons why the uprising took place. It was not that they were destabilizing it just because it felt like it, that it was a mood of hortal, but there was a pent-up frustration, and it would not have come to this stage if, when the quota agitation started, Hasina had not responded with bullets. She responded with bullets, and she's now paying for those sins, and which is something we need to recognize. Now, what happens after that, one simply doesn't know. The hope is that the army will behave responsibly. There will be a caretaker government, as Bangladesh used to have between 2005 and 2008.
Yeah.
You will have that, and you will have a new election, which will show us what Bangladeshis want, and ultimately that has to be respected, as so long as it's a free and fair election. Bangladesh hasn't had a free and fair election since 2008. Let's remember that.
Sadanand, last word to you. Maybe you're right that what follows is going to be worse for India, maybe, and possibly worse for Bangladesh.
Why do you keep saying this? My point is that it's worse for Bangladesh. That's my main
I'm
point.
saying it. Okay, all right. Maybe you're right that what happens next is worse for Bangladesh. I am saying, I think as an Indian, there is great amount of concern about what the repercussions are for India. But I take Salil's point. That's not the Bangladeshi citizens' problem. My question to you is simply this. Let's assume what follows is worse. The point is sometimes a political churn is inevitable because it's caused by factors that trigger that response. I think that's the argument that Salil is making, that we don't know what comes next, but that doesn't mean that Hasina should be defended. She brought this upon herself. Your last word on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I'm not saying that Sheikh Hasina did not make many big mistakes during her rule, or that criticizing her is invalid, or that she's some kind of paragon of virtue. And I certainly think she misplayed. Obviously, the proof is what we saw. She obviously sort of misplayed her hand in this in dealing with these protests, or else she wouldn't have had to flee the country. So that goes without saying. My view is a little bit different than I gather that Salil's is, in terms of assessing what comes next. I think regardless of who votes for it and who doesn't, I think it's possible to assess what comes next in terms of outcomes. And so, for example, let's just say, sort of hypothetically, let's just say Afghanistan, right? Let's just say everybody decided to vote for a government that doesn't want to educate women and wants to start chopping off hands. I wouldn't say that that's a good outcome for the country or a good outcome for the region. So I'm not saying that exactly is going to happen in Bangladesh, but I think that we are, if you judge Bangladesh's last 15 years under Hasina as the country moving in a different direction. I mean, I take Salil's point that there is a tendency to exaggerate the comparisons between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Bangladesh is always different from Pakistan. But at the same time, I think you have to accept that if you look at it sort of in terms of broad parameters, directionally, before the advent of Hasina in 2008, Bangladesh was moving in a Pakistan-like direction. In fact, a former Bangladesh and Pakistan expert at the State Department, Bill Milam, wrote a book in the around 2009 or 10, basically pointing out all the striking similarities: military coups, violence against minorities, instability, hostility towards India, room for terrorist groups, in the Bangladeshi case, things like Hujibi. So the trajectory of Bangladesh was not very promising if we had had this conversation, say, in 2006. What Sheikh Hasina's great achievement was, and she has many flaws, we all agree, her great achievement was she turned around the trajectory of her country fundamentally. That is not a small achievement. My big worry is that post-Hasina, the country will revert to the mean. And reversion to the mean in that case is not a very happy thought.
Okay, we leave it there. We don't know. We have to wait and see what unfolds in Bangladesh. And at the moment, we don't even know where Sheikh Hasina is and how long she'll be in India. So the questions are really mounting. I mean, is she just leaving politics, as her son suggests? Is she going to go back to Bangladesh one day? Is this? We simply don't know. But I think your concerns are well flagged, and Salil's counters to them are also something to think about. Thank you to Salil and Sadanand for this very interesting debate, and to our audience for watching. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.